My name is David West, and I'm here to talk to you about a topic that is very important to me. That is war. Sorry, I didn't have time to memorize this. I wrote it last night, but hopefully you enjoy it. There's an old saying generally attributed to 19th century English economist John Stuart Mills that war apologists love to quote. It goes, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling which thinks that nothing is worth war is much worse. The person who has nothing for which he is willing to fight, nothing which is more important than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself." The most glaring problem with this school of thought is that it treats the idea that all who oppose war are pacifists as a foregone conclusion. That in opposition to the state's bloody campaigns rules out the possibility of an individual believing in genuine self-defense. That it is not an uncompromising respect for the sanctity of human life that fuels an opposition to war, but a selfish love of one's own flesh. Fortunately, I can say beyond any shadow of a doubt that I am a living, breathing testament to the inaccuracies of this thinking, and I hope that the same can be said of all of you. A little over 3 years ago, I enlisted in the Army 2 weeks out of high school. Having grown up my whole life hearing of the irreproachable nobility of America's armed forces and feeling called by God to liberate the oppressed and defend the innocent, I figured I'd be the best of the best. I wanted to be a U.S. Army Ranger. It wasn't long after I arrived in Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training that I realized I was one of the few people who bought into the whole God and country spiel. Most guys there seemed to be in it for the money, or the benefits, or to pay for their college. Lots of guys even claimed they were in it to kill people. But instead of letting this give me pause, I just shrugged it off and figured that once I got a little further along in my training and was alongside people who had enlisted to be Rangers like I had, things would be different. I convinced myself that those people would believe in the cause just like I did. But as I made my way through advanced individual training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, airborne school at Fort Benning, Georgia, and finally the Ranger indoctrination program, I was forced to start coming to grips with the fact that not only were soldiers not the noble defenders of freedom I had been told they were, but that they may be very nearly the polar opposite. Couple this growing realization with the sinking suspicion that the government was becoming increasingly hell-bent on vilifying support for everything I held near and dear, Christianity, guns, the Constitution, Ron Paul, as warning signs of potential domestic kicking in their door, a reasonable request when your mission may well include killing them, only to be reminded that I was a private and didn't need to be thinking about these matters. I begin to wonder why I was pointing guns at women and children sleeping contentedly on the roofs of their homes. Why most of our missions boil down to little more than the borderline door-to-door enforcement of draconian Iraqi gun laws. Whether what I was doing was upholding my oath to defend the Constitution or violating it. Why so many of my fellow soldiers took it as their patriotic duty to beat detainees whose only crime was looking old enough to hold a rifle to the point of pissing and puking all over themselves. I remember one mission in particular. After tearing apart a bedroom from ceiling to floor in search of contraband, I dutifully reported back to my squad leader with the sole unloaded rifle magazine that had been found. Later, as I look back on what had happened, I realized the hypocrisy of my actions. Back home, rifle magazines can be found by the dozen in my bedroom, and they're usually loaded. How could I claim to believe in the right to keep and bear arms while depriving another human being of that right? How could someone who owns dozens of firearms and thousands of rounds of ammunition in good conscience arrest someone who lives in a war zone and could be forced to defend their family at any moment for owning more than one rifle and 50 rounds of ammunition? At one point, while we were training between missions, my squad leader asked me a theoretical question. Would I call for fire on a building if it meant killing 100 civilians to take out a machine gun nest and save one Ranger? My answer was a resolute no. I told him that, as Rangers, we were willing combatants and that our job was to defend the innocent, even if it meant sustaining higher casualties ourselves. Flabbergasted, he tried to show me the error of my ways. These people live like animals, he said. 100 of them aren't worth one of us. Still, I refused to budge. Before long, other squad leaders were parading their privates through my room like I was a circus freak. Look at West, they'd say. You don't want to be like him. He wouldn't kill civilians to save you. I had started to become a traitor in their eyes. And as I was becoming less and less able to lie to myself, I realized that they may have a point. I was starting to sympathize more with the people we were fighting than with my fellow soldiers. I was starting to realize that all these wars were doing was making enemies for America. In November 2009, several months after my company had returned to garrison in Fort Benning, Georgia, our company commander gathered us together to inform us that the kid that killed our corporal in Iraq had just been released from jail. He had served 6 months in prison, and with time served, he was already out. As a collective gasp left the mouths of my company, I stood in stunned silence as I heard the full details of how this young corporal had been killed for the first time. As it turns out, he was shot by a 13-year-old with an SKS rifle. Now, while everyone else gathered at the time was thinking about how wicked and deserving of destruction a society that drives their children to fight must be, I was having a hard time vilifying a child who had been forced into a terrible situation by foreign invaders. It was at this moment that I realized that I had both a 13-year-old brother and an SKS rifle. And you know what? If jackbooted foreign invaders kicked in my door in the middle of the night to haul me off for being a dissident, I hope he'd have the balls to defend me and his family. I realized then, more than ever, that the people we were fighting were no different than you or I. And as long as I live, I will never forget what my ostensibly Christian company commander said next. "That's the Iraqi justice system for you," he said. "But that's all right, because we're going to get revenge next deployment when we go to Afghanistan and put all the fucking Muslims to sleep." As murmurs of agreement ran through the formation, my stomach turned and my heart sank. I was both disgusted and saddened, but I had found the vindication I'd been searching for. I knew what I had to do. Less than a month later, I filed for discharge from the Army as a conscientious objector. It blew the minds of my chain of command that someone who was decidedly not a pacifist, and who was in fact an ardent advocate of self-defense and the defense of the innocent, would dare seek discharge as a conscientious objector. They offered me a job working in the mailroom and promised I would never deploy if I accepted it, but I refused. To me, discharge seemed the only logical choice for someone who was actually interested in upholding his oath to defend freedom. To make a long story short, a process that, according to Army regulations, should have only taken a few months, ended up being stonewalled to the point that it wasn't until December 2010, nearly 14 months later, that I was discharged from the Army. And now, here I am, fighting for something I really believe in. The kind of warmongers I mentioned at the beginning of this speech would probably be shocked by what I've said here. They would probably say that I hate my country or that I'm anti-American, but that couldn't be any farther from the truth. I love the people I live with. I love the land I live on. Should they ever face an existential threat, be it by enemies foreign or domestic, I will fight ferociously to protect them. But because of this love, I must stand up to the bloodthirsty and tyrannical government that is currently inflicted on us. I've seen behind the curtain. I know that Washington and its lackeys, the banksters and the military-industrial complex, pose a greater threat to America than any illiterate third-world tribesman with an AK-47 ever could. In closing, as a follower of Jesus Christ, as an American, as a freedom-loving individual, and as a staunch opponent of war, I want to encourage everyone here to strive for a society forged not with the violent hammer of government, but through the voluntary cooperation of individuals. A world ruled not by the Machiavellian plans of an oligarchy or the dictates of the masses, but by the idea that individuals are free and sovereign, and that we have a right to life, liberty, and property. So before I finish, I would like to leave you with a few pieces of advice. Number one, never initiate the use of force, even when you think it will serve a greater good. It won't. Number two, live, think, and trade freely. Number three, a collective can never have more rights than the individuals who comprise it. And number four, to quote one of my all-time favorite literary characters, never compromise, not even in the face of Armageddon. Hoorah! Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was truly inspiring. That was wonderful.